Okay, before we get to this stream, we're going to be posting my Patreon in the chat. And for those interested, this is going to be, and then that'll be for in the chat for people to just get the link. And it's also in the bottom of the description. This one's going to be on the NATO-Turkey conflict. It's basically about Turkey purchasing a Russian air defense system, when initially it was the U.S. who had promised they could purchase it but had pulled back. So they had gone to Russia to actually purchase it, and then the U.S. goes, no, you're not allowed to purchase it anymore from us. So now we had this conflict with NATO, and NATO is up in arms over it. Now, when we start to look at NATO, we need to understand what they are. So NATO really, when we start to look at what they really are, is they're kind of this units that should essentially focus on its two objectives that were initially set back after World War, not much after its inception, after well, it would have been partially during the World War, but it's or it actually would have been after the World Wars, but it's basically its inception was for two objectives. Number one was for common defense, and number two would have been for within this Cold War to stop the Soviet Union. Now, as we all know, the Soviet Union is well gone. This was its main objective, as to kind of keep an eye on the Soviet Union, make sure there's no massive aggression, to stop any type of massive war from happening by using a common defense against them, because at that time they were a much larger country. Since they are now a much smaller country, that no longer really holds water. Now it's for the common defense of those states. And with that, we need to really analyze what that actually means. There's a lot of countries that actually look toward that and say, well, we don't really see that as being a legitimate cause anymore for that, and we've discussed this earlier today. And now we tend to look at, why are they so up in arms over this purchase? Well, this seems more like NATO is not working within its two objectives. Now, I am actually against NATO itself. I find that it's a complete and utter waste of money, and you'll actually see that this is going to expose that right here. And when we start to look at it, why are they so concerned over them purchasing either why are they so concerned about them purchasing member-based equipment? Specifically equipment from the United States. Now, this is very, very disturbing if they're so concerned over that. Why is this such an issue? Because it would seem that that since the Soviet Union is gone, Russia is actually not a threat. Because we know that Russia has not shown aggression toward any country at all during this whatsoever. The only instances in which we've seen aggression have actually come from NATO themselves. NATO themselves have actually done as much as put in more member countries going right up to the border of Russia, and actually done war games on their actual border. So when it comes down to aggression, we're talking, this is where NATO really comes in. So when it goes back down to it, we know that Russia is not being aggressive, but actually acting in more of a defensive manner, and going, well, what are you doing on our border? And why are you doing these war games on our border, which is antagonizing our country? Now we see that basically that they're looking for, that they get mad when all of a sudden that one member country all of a sudden starts purchasing weapons from Russia. Well, it seems more that they have this idea of wanting to create more boogeymen. And since Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, they've broken up long ago. This means Russia is not a threat. We can see that if we start to look at the military spending by country, you can see that you'll see that the world total for GDP is 2.2%. This is for the 2018 list. This would be last year's. And the top 15 budgets, you will see that number one is the United States at 610 billion. Two is China at 200. This is 2018 fact sheet for 2017, so it's actually not last year's spending, but the year before. So we were 610 billion, 228 billion for China. Saudi Arabia 69.4 billion, and in fourth place was Russia at 66.3 billion. India at 63.9 billion, France 57.8 billion, United Kingdom 47.2 billion, Japan at 45.4, Germany at 44.3, South Korea at 39.2, Brazil at 29.3, Italy at 29.2, Australia at 27.5, Canada at 20.6, and Turkey at 18.2. So if we start to look at this, you will see that many of these members are actually on that list. And you'll see with, like, let's say we look at Russia. Well, Russia is at fourth. If you look at the actual expenditures of France, France is only a small amount behind Russia. You had France and the United Kingdom right there. Those two countries that are actually relatively close, just separated by a channel. And they are well above what Russia is spending right there. And now when you start to add other countries like Germany, like Italy, like Turkey, you start to add these other countries into it, and you're going to notice that when you get to them, you're going to see that when it comes down to the country, is they're not really much of a threat when it comes down to the actual amount of money that they're putting in. Now, when you look at that was for 2017, this is for actual 2018, where we went up to 643.3 billion. China dropped down to 168.2. Saudi Arabia at 82.9. Russia at 63.1. 57.9 for India. UK was 56.1. Then you go to 53.4 for France, 47.3 for Japan, 45.7 for Germany, South Korea 39.2, 28 for Brazil, Australia 26.6, Italy 24.9, Israel 21.6, and Iraq 19.6. So we start to look at that, we can see that on those ones, that's probably a wider span with it being able to grab it. And you can see that it shows that even with that, you can see that there's countries that are spending more. I mean, Saudi Arabia is spending more than, is still spending more than Russia is. And yet they showed no concern over Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is, when we start to look at it, this is a country that is exporting terrorism. And that should be a concern for any country out there. And they shouldn't really have, if they're looking at any concern. Now, this is something, especially when we had NATO stupidly getting involved in wars with it. When we look at NATO, I mean, you look at the NATO involvement in one of the biggest involvements was Libya. Now, this is a big portion of why you had a lot of the crisis in the Middle East. And this was one of the big things to deliver weapons into those so-called moderate rebels into Syria. Now, those people end up being what we call ISIS. And that's a problem. And that whole process was essentially through the whole thing of NATO. Now, this is through the NATO overthrowing of Gaddafi. And this was the whole process in Libya. It started with the whole process in Libya. And this is something that we need to look at. And when we start to look at what the actual objectives are, and so why are they actually concerned about why were they actually concerned about Turkey buying from Russia? Well, they've basically decided that Russia is still a boogeyman, and they wanted to make them out to be this. We can see that Russia, when it comes to military expenditures, would not be a major thing. Now, what is Russia worried about mostly is actually terrorism. Well, when we see that Saudi Arabia is exporting it, we can see that their major objective is actually just trying to keep up with Saudi Arabia's training and with Saudi Arabia's training of them and exporting of terrorism around the globe. And we need to, and that's basically what they're trying to do, is trying to keep up with what's hitting their areas of their country. And then when you start to look at a map of Asia, you're going to see kind of where they're hitting at. And you're going to see a lot of countries around them that are that would actually impact them on the southern end. And you'll see that how it impacts them through all these different countries. It's not as much on the European side, but it's much of what they can get on the of ones that touch Central Asia, and then ones that touch the Middle East, and these different nations. And this is what's coming in through. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. These are the ones that they can actually go right through and impact them. And you can see that, and Azerbaijan as well. When you start to look at, and these are things that can actually go right through. And you see that this is a major problem for them. They can actually impact their actual nation. And that it's something that needs to be understood. And that's what they're spending a lot of their defense on, is just basically going after these groups, because that's what's important to their defense. And the rest of it is basically ensuring that NATO does not cause a massive war, because they've lined a lot of things because they wanted Ukraine to flip. They got Belarus, they got Latvia, they got Estonia, and they keep going all the way down this list when you start to look at it. And when you look how close Moscow is to to a lot of these groups like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, those were ones that they brought in about 2004. Now this is key to understanding what's going on in that region. And you should understand what's actually happening. And when you do that and you have Turkey down here, you should understand what's kind of going on, that they're actually surrounding them. And you obviously have had countries like Finland, Norway, and Sweden up there. So when you look at it, it's basically they're essentially surrounded. So what's happening is Moscow is their capital. That's a very, very important city. And when you have these ones that are actually going right up to the border, and they're actually essentially doing the war games right at the border lines. And this is very, very important to understand, is this is essentially aggression on NATO. And this needs to be understood. And this is what's actually happening. Now, if Russia were to do, if it were flipped, and if we were to say that if we're back when the Soviet Union existed and they went up like let's say right up to Poland's border, you can bet that that this would essentially cause some serious problems out there. That people would start flipping out. And this was basically back in the era where we had the Soviet Union now, and if they went up and were starting to do military actions right up here on the actual border of Poland, back when they had all these republics. And if they were to do that, then people would start flipping out, and that would probably cause a world war. But it would probably have been World War III if they would have done that. But what's happening is they're using restraint on this, and they're saying, back away, stop doing this. You're deliberately trying to antagonize. And what's also happening is we can see that when Turkey is buying from Russia, basically their closest partner is, they are a member state, that is basically, we can see that this is really boiling down to, it's more about supporting defense contractors who are linked with the United States, and this is what needs to be understood. And it needs to be understood that this is what the actual country, what the actual system of NATO is about. It's not about actually working on a common defense, because if it was about common defense, they would start going back and looking at the actual things such as the GDP numbers. They'd see, okay, we have China, which is starting to reduce its spending, so we can see that out there that we know that we're in a position to where the world's less dangerous. We see Saudi Arabia starting to put more money out there. We can see that it's basically trying to export a lot more of its terrorism. We can see Russia basically having to, starting to cut back its money. So it's basically stated that it's basically made it so it can stabilize its borders, and it's basically reducing its defense spending. And we see things like but yet we're seeing certain countries in Europe that are bending to the will of NATO, that are pumping up money, and yet certain other ones are basically Germany staying up roughly the same. But you have other ones like Italy that are basically saying, we're actually going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to reduce money because we don't find an actual threat. Italy went from 29.2 down to 24.9. And this should be an actual this should be an actual note when it comes down to it. Piece you can see with it when it comes down to it is most of the countries, when they're spending, is most of the countries around the globe tend to be within the realm of under 2%. And a lot of these countries are quite safe. There are certain countries that are obviously unknown, but most of the countries around the globe are actually below 2% in spending. There's only a few countries that are above this 2% margin. There's out of those ones with it, there's not many of them with it, so there's only a small fraction that are actually spending a decent amount above it. And when we get to the ones that are spending above 3%, with above like the 3% margin, we're getting into only a very, very small amount. The ones that are spending extremely high with it, there's only like two that are getting above 10%. There's only a couple of nations that fall within that, and spending within above like around like 7%-ish. Between 5 to 7%, we're talking there's only a couple of countries around there. So there's what we're talking is most of the nation is actually settled within 2%. Most of the world is 2% or less, and this should be understood. And this means that what NATO's trying to push is basically settling in a lot of money for these military contractors. And this would be establishing a lot of money for them, and where they can siphon off each of the defense of each of these countries. And that's why they want more and more people coming in. If you look at Colombia, Colombia's by far the highest defense spender in South America that's known. Thus why they've been inducted in. And they sit right next to Venezuela, which if you look for, since they do like war, that's another one they want to induct in. You'll see that that they might want to induct countries around Iran, because they want that to basically be torn down as well. They tend to want to look to countries that they want to cause a lot of strife under. Now, probably not going to do Mongolia with it. You know, it sits between Russia and China, because it's not going to have the power to do anything. But you might see something like India or something being brought in. And this is basically what it is. It's basically for two purposes. Number one, intervention. Number two, selling a lot of weapons and weapon systems to military contractors. And this is really its point. And the reason why it needs a PR arm in the Atlantic Council is, without this PR arm, it wouldn't really have the ability to shut down people that are talking against them. Because otherwise, really, the Atlantic Council has no purpose. The Atlantic Council is really just a PR arm, and people need to really understand this, and it really has no function whatsoever. It's basically, that's how they get their point across for more intervention. It's no different than one of these neoconservative think tanks. It's just doing it on an international scale. Even though NATO is essentially, for the most part of the UN, it's essentially will, when the UN tends to opt against intervention, they will essentially say, to hell with the UN's decision, we're doing it anyway. And that's where you get it. And that's because what they're doing is they're saying this is a positive idea for the military contractors and we need to raise their money. And that's why when you go back to this idea of why is this purchase of this Russian air defense system bad? Well, it doesn't benefit these military contractors. Those military contractors don't make any money when they're not buying from them. If they're not buying from the right people, then it just harms the contractors. And if Turkey were to go to war, it wouldn't raise the value of those contractors being Raytheon or Boeing or God knows what they are. I mean, there's Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, United Technologies Corporation, L3 Technologies, BAE Systems. These are the ones out there. So Huntington, Gallus, Honeywell, Leidos, Textron, Booz Allen Hamilton, General Electric. But if you look at like companies that are specifically dependent on it, we have Raytheon. 94% of their revenue comes from defense. Lockheed Martin, 88% from defense. Northrop Grumman, 87% from defense. Huntington and Ingalls, 74%. Booz Allen Hamilton, 70% from defense. General Dynamics, 63% from defense. Leidos, 43% from defense. Boeing, 29% from defense. Textron, 29% from defense. United Technologies, 13%. L3 Technologies, 12%. Honeywell, 11%. And General Electric, 3%. That should give you an idea of what's happening with them. So I mean, we got so there's basically, so with these ones, you're talking that there's a lot of money to be made, and that's what we find it with. And there's other companies out there such as Airbus. Airbus is another one that's a European company, and they're ones that are out there that are making planes as well, and these are other ones that are essentially out there that make planes based both for commercial purposes and for military purposes. And when you find that a country such as Turkey goes, you know, we're going to go outside of this realm of these military contractors, we're going to go buy the stuff from Russia. We find that they have a better deal. That because you didn't buy on this preset list of who you can buy from, that's going to infuriate NATO, because you didn't buy on this preset list. It didn't matter that they bought from Russia, but buying from Russia was even worse because Russia is the boogeyman right now. and that's what needs to be understood. And because they dared to do that, they infuriated NATO even more so. And that's I'm not saying that Turkey's this perfect country, but this is why they had that problem. Now, what we should be looking at is, why do we even have these two things of NATO and the Atlantic Council? Frankly, they shouldn't even exist, because when we look at things, we see that a lot of these countries in Europe are starting to reduce their defense spending. Well, we're not finding that with systems of France and England. The rest of them are reducing defense spending, and they're cutting it down because they don't find a need. Now, France and England have always had this history of intervention. If you look at what actually caused the carve up of the Middle East, that was after World War I, and what actually caused World War I, it was France and England. So these two actually have a history of intervention, so they will keep pumping more money into their defense, and it won't essentially show an actual trend in what's actually happening globally. They'll just do this based on what they actually want to do from an actual global standpoint, and it will impact more of the ideas of their leaders rather than the actual what's actually happening around the globe and what's actually happening from a defense standpoint. Now, for the other countries, it's going to be different. They'll probably have a standpoint which is going to be a little bit different, and they will probably be impacting themselves from what is actually happening around the globe and what they view as actual national security means. This would refer to their situation being solely on a basis of what is going out in the world. And that's why when we have people like Trump stating, "Oh, these countries need to pay more," no, that's not the solution. And I think that's actually quite a silly solution to even be offered in the first place. It's not that we need countries to pay more. We actually need the opposite. We actually, if they don't feel the need to pay more, we shouldn't be forcing them to pay more. We should be examining why they don't feel the need to pay more. And if we see that them saying, "Okay, there's no purpose to this," that means we should say, "Okay, we need to eliminate this completely." If this is the case, then we should basically go in the opposite direction. And we should say, "Okay, we need to eliminate NATO completely." And to me, I think Trump should reconsider his cabinet and reconsider his VP, because his VP seems to be really, really high on NATO. Meanwhile, he doesn't seem to be so much, and that's really a conflict when it comes down to his cabinet and when it comes down to him himself. I don't think Pence and him see eye to eye in the way that NATO should be done. When he wants to get rid of NATO, and Pence says, Pence acts like NATO's this great thing, and we need to pump more money into NATO, and NATO's always been great, and just pumping out different ideas of intervention and basically counteracting him. I don't think he needs to keep Pence around, because Pence is not exactly your brightest brick in the wall. I mean, this is the person who on the, I believe, he was House of Representatives. Let me double check that. Yeah, he was House of Representatives. He had the audacity to want to actually dedicate a day to Garfield the cat. This is a person that wanted to dedicate a day to a cat. I mean, and this person is our VP. Now, obviously, we haven't had the best luck at VPs in recent history. We've had Mike Pence. We've had want to dedicate a day to a cat. previous to him, we had Joe Biden, we call him Creepy Uncle Joe for a reason of wanting to smell people's hair. Before him, we had the situation with Dick Cheney, who basically never met a war he didn't like and never wanted to become president, because the fact is he would actually have to own every war that he proposed. Then you go back before him is you have Al Gore, who basically they aptly made fun of him on South Park with the man bear pig thing because of his just complete and utter absurdity on the global warming, and basically making movies off of it when they were completely when it was basically not based off fact but based off fear and religion, and that the whole hockey stick thing turned out to be completely false. And then they use the excuse of, oh, it was a pause, so we can tell that he's a complete and utter fraud and complete and utter insane person. We go back before him, and then we have Mr. I Can't Spell Right, Dan Quayle. We go back before him, and we have George Herbert Walker Bush. Enough said there. And it keeps going back. I mean, we haven't had exactly the best luck of VPs. They're just complete and utterly insane. And this is why I talk about that, is because you can't exactly trust your VP, but at least get someone who's at least sane. I mean, maybe we can start a new trend with that and to start basically removing some of these insane people. I know sometimes they use it for actual job security, but sometimes you can go in the opposite direction and say, okay, I'm this much pro-liberty, and I'm going to basically get someone who's even more pro-liberty. So if you dare even try to kill me with it, I'm going to, if the bureaucracy dares to try and kill me, I'm going to basically make sure that I get replaced by someone who's going to make your job even worse. And but no one ever thinks in that manner. They tend to think in the opposite manner of I'm basically this person who's going to basically be anti-liberty, and I'm going to put someone who's anti-liberty, even more anti-liberty, below me. Not so good with it, because Trump needs to realize with it is they're going to still want him out if Pence is sitting there. You need to go in the opposite direction. And this is why when we get where this comes in with NATO with it is Pence is always going to sit there and act like NATO's great because he's a neocon. And he basically, instead of praising something simple like Jim Davis or something that would have made sense, he actually had the audacity to praise an orange cartoon cat on the House of Representatives floor, and this is going to be forever known for our country, which is a complete and utter embarrassment. And this is why we shouldn't be accepting this as an actual thing for someone making policy. And these are the types of people who are basically saying NATO is great. We can also go with people who actually do not make these insane comments, who basically say NATO has run its course, and get rid of NATO, which would actually be the smart thing, because we could state that NATO was originally meant to counteract the Soviet Union, and it was part of the Cold War era, and this Cold War era is long since gone, and we need to understand this. We need to understand the Cold War is over. It's been over for a long time. We start to realize that when the Berlin Wall was pretty much coming down and when the Soviet Union officially fell, we're talking when we start to when the Soviet Union fell, we're talking this is approximately about 27 years and change from now. And that should be something that we should understand. We're getting very, very close to 30 years on top of that point. And when that happens, we need to understand that this is something very, very important. And this should be something that we grasp onto. And it's not just something that we can go, hey, this is something that is not that important. We can actually ignore the facts and we can move on, and we can continue this thing, and we can repurpose NATO. No, you don't want to repurpose something, just like I've stated earlier today, because the fact is when you start to repurpose things, they basically become very, very corrupt, as NATO has. It's all about, it's just a basic defense contractor slush fund, and that's what it's become. And it's this common defense thing is, even the actual member states of Europe don't even believe in it anymore, and that should be what we should believe in. The only ones who actually do support it are people who've actually been interventionists from the start, and actually were the ones that actually created all of the mess of the world wars to begin with. And should we even trust those members to begin with? And I don't believe that we should trust those two members. And those are the United Kingdom and or England and France. Since they were the ones that actually were the aggressors in World War I, and then end up after basically putting sanctions on Germany when Germany was not the aggressor, which ended up creating the rise of Hitler, which created World War II, ended up carving up the Middle East, which caused all of the wars that we've seen out there, ended up shipping Eastern European immigrants from England down there, which caused the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because you essentially kicked all the Palestinians off their own land and created that problem. I mean, how could you even trust these two countries? And they've also been ones that have actually been supportive of the most intervention in the areas continued since that point, since they've relinquished their properties down there. So we can't exactly trust these two countries. So even though they're spending more money when it comes to defense, we shouldn't trust other countries. We shouldn't trust them at all. We should actually be looking in a different direction and say, hey, this thing needs to end, and we don't care what you want to do with it. You guys can have it if you want, but we're out. And if the U.S. ducks out, we know the thing's going to fold, because there's not going to be any more than just the United Kingdom and France left over, because no other member state's going to continue with it, because even the new members that have joined in are going to say, you know what, we're not interested in this, and they're just going to go on their own. And they're not going to be continuing with this idea of this failed experiment in common defense. They might create some type of EU army, but it's going to be completely separate, and they're going to drop it because they realize that this is nothing more than a shakedown situation for people to support these defense contractors. And that's really what the NATO's all about, is they want to shake down people to support these defense contractors. That's why they want them to spend more money. And they got Trump on board with this stupid idea of saying, oh, you at least need to spend 2%. Well, why? Why do you have to spend 2% of your GDP? Oh, because it means everybody's spending an equal amount. Well, no, because the U.S. is still spending more. If this were the case, then the U.S. should actually be spending about 2/3 of what it's really spending. Is the U.S. willing to drop from this amount that it's currently spending down to about $400 billion? And you're not going to find anyone in the Pentagon that is willing to accept that. And this is the whole point. They want to spend more and more and more. And because the defense contractors say so. and this is where it comes from, and we know this, and so that number is just an arbitrary number, and making all of them come into that number is just, it doesn't even make any sense. And this is why the idea of common defense doesn't make any sense either. Now, while I think that we should only be spending about $250 billion, and this should only be used for the defense here with our only territories, and shut down all of our overseas bases, and we should only worry about our country itself, which would actually reduce us down below that 2%. It would actually put us down at like 1 point something percent, I think. Let's see what let's see if I can't find out a general amount. So it's about 41% of what we're spending from that. Yeah, about 1.3% approximately would be our percentage, which would be approximately around where Canada is spending. Which, since Canada, for GDP, which, since Canada is only focusing on their defense for the most part, it would make complete sense. And that would be what we would be doing. Now, obviously, we have a higher GDP than them, but it would be within the realm. And we would be focusing purely on the United States and its own properties. Now, where would we be on the actual number for our defense next to other countries? We'd be about 80 billion ahead of anyone else, because China would be second place to anyone else, to any other in all countries, and we would still be ahead of them. And this is why when people go, oh, but you're not, but what about for GDP? You're not keeping up with the GDP of other countries, and that doesn't even make sense when people make that argument, because it's a totally illegitimate argument when it comes down to it, because you need to only focus on what is necessary for your country, not an argument based off GDP, because the percentage based off GDP is a completely fly-by-night argument. And I think that's where people need to understand that. And that's something that is really kind of pointless. And that's something that needs to be understood. And that's why when people, you'll find a lot of people that'll argue that point of saying, oh, but they're only spending this much percentage on defense next to other countries with it, and see how Saudi Arabia is spending 10%. Well, Saudi Arabia is at the top of the map. When you start to look at us with it, we're right near the top when it comes down to GDP. And when you start to look at it and compare other countries, we're at about 1.5 times the average GDP for a country in the whole world. So the United States is spending well beyond its means when it comes down to it, and when it comes down to it, is if you view the ideas of sovereignty as something legitimate, you should understand that it's not any purpose. Now, now going back to this whole point is, We could see that if all countries are going to work on their own sovereignty and protect themselves, it's also going to mean a lot more for peace, because if you're responsible for yourself, you can't rely on another nation to say, jump in when you're being the aggressor. And this is going to create a lot of different situations for what's going to happen globally. And globally, we're not going to see a country that's going to or a group of countries that are going to be aggressors and act well out of their means, such as NATO. We're not going to see NATO anymore that's going to do things like go to war out in Libya because they don't like the leader, try to overthrow Venezuela because they don't like the leader there, go to war without any type of authorization in countries like they did in Kosovo, even though there wasn't any legitimate evidence. When we see with the UN was telling them there was no legitimate evidence, and yet they went to war anyway. They had already made their decision well before, and this is something that needs to be understood. And we've found this when it comes to NATO, and it's just about pumping money for these defense contractors. And this is why we get back to what the conflict between NATO and Turkey is they had the audacity to buy a system in which is not going to pump money into the defense contractors' sales, and was not going to make them money. And by doing so with it, they infuriated NATO. And that's what caused the actual problem. And this is really what it boils down to. And NATO's not about common defense. It's not, because if you look after what happened with the attacks of 9/11, they weren't looking at common defense there. When you look at these ideas of common defense, they don't follow that whatsoever. NATO doesn't act in defense; they're actually acting in offense. And there's several. I already listed several instances of that. Plus the actual. Plus the military. Operations that they're running right on the border of Russia. That's not defense. That's actually offense. They're actually trying to antagonize Russia. So we know that they're not actually acting in a peaceful manner, and they're not being defensive. They're actually being offensive. And so we know that they're not. So we know it's not for common defense. It's actually they're not doing that. We know that we've already talked to the Soviet Union no longer exists. So its function is not even keeping up with its function anymore. We know for common defense that it could actually be reducing its budget, and it doesn't need to be doing what it's doing. And it's not even it's no longer even keeping up with its actual name. It's supposed to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What's it doing down there with allowing countries like Colombia in it? Colombia is not North Atlantic. It's not even really Atlantic. It's actually the Caribbean Sea down there, and that's something that needs to be understood. When we're talking about the Caribbean Sea, that's not really the Atlantic. North Atlantic should be basically just the United States, maybe Canada, Mexico, maybe certain northern parts of the Caribbean, and then Europe. That should be about it. And there should be really nothing else. And then maybe if you want parts of, if you want to go into Asia, that's fine. But that's in certain parts of Asia that touch it. That's about it. There shouldn't be any more, and it should be for common defense. And if we're talking about that, it should be, well, what are you doing common defense against with it? And if you could go right across the board, all the way to the shoreline on the other side if you wanted, and just if you want to do that, and say on the north, like a northern hemisphere thing, and just say we're going to put Russia in, because frankly Russia is not the Soviet Union anymore, and they but the fact is you eliminate that boogeyman, and that means it would kill a lot of the funding that NATO would receive. NATO would then be cut down to a great deal, and this would essentially eliminate what you'd be focusing on. It would be more focusing on ensuring that these countries from the Middle East do not invade North and cause problems, and that would be its sole purpose. Now, I'm probably just going to end it right here. If you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and make sure you share it all around your friends and everywhere else. Make sure you check out my Patreon page. It's in the chat right now. If you check this out later, it's in the description at the bottom. And that's about it. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye, everyone.